we saw the plans for October 7th. You can look at the studies that went into that, the building of the underground infrastructure and the more formal training that Hamas was getting. They have naval commandos, they have intelligence units, they have cyber units, they have drone units. And all of this was getting put in motion then. When October 7th happened, I remember I was at home and I'm starting seeing the reports of rocket attacks and an over the border raid. And I'm like, oh my God, this is insane. And then the following weeks that happened, I was learning more about the tunnels and kidnapping. I'm like, this is very familiar. I've read about this in textbooks. We saw it then. And it was very disappointing. I'm like, how did sort of Israel get lulled to sleep by this?
Today's guest has seen Israel's security challenges from both sides, on the battlefield and from inside the world of U.S. national security. Justin Leopold-Cohen grew up in New York before moving to Israel and volunteering to serve in the IDF's Nahal Infantry Brigade. He was deployed to Gaza border during Operation Protected Edge, and later went on to work in U.S. national security. Today, he's a senior research analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on U.S.-Israel security cooperation, the Middle East, and Israel's qualitative military edge. With the region changing dramatically from Hezbollah and Lebanon to Iran and the future of the U.S.-Israel alliance, there's a lot to discuss. Justin, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Justin, I want to start from the beginning. You grew up in New York City. What made you leave America and volunteer to serve as an infantryman in the IDF?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York City. I was born there. I'm an American citizen. Parents are American, going back 4 generations. And I started thinking about it when I was in college. I went to an undergraduate university right outside of Boston. And you get to that last year and you start thinking, okay, I better start thinking, what do I do when I graduate? And I heard about a friend getting involved in security studies, and I didn't know that was really a field. And I started researching it, and it seemed this, blend of military history. I'm like, this is something I could get into. And I'd always been very passionate about Israel. I grew up in, strong, pro-Israel household, and nothing compared to today's, encampments, but there was an anti-Israel presence on campus that kind of motivated me to always, stay up on the facts, be ready to talk about it. And I'm like, all right, let me put my money where my mouth is, and let me go, see what, I can really give all I can. And I, was able to track down, how do you enlist as a foreign citizen, which Israel is one of the few countries that does allow that. Israel, the United Kingdom, South Korea has a program. Of course, there's the French Foreign Legion is very famous. And Israel has this for American diaspora Jews. And so I graduated in May and I drafted in August of 2013. And the first thing they did is, language training. And I'd taken some very basic Hebrew, but I did not pass the test to go right in. So I was put into Hebrew training before I joined the Nahal Infantry Brigade a few months later. Then your basic training, your advanced training, fully integrated in with the Israelis, who were all, of course, 18, which is a bit of a gap in maturity, even though it's only a few years. Those are pretty critical years. And then we finished our advanced training in May of the following year. And then, of course, the lead up to Operation Protective Edge was Operation Brother Keeper, where 3 Israeli boys were kidnapped and murdered. And that quickly developed into a full-scale operation into Gaza. Many of my unit did go into Gaza. I was part of a group that stayed on the border area, and it was just under 2 months long. And it's funny, thinking about it now, you kind of see some of the signs that led to October 7th. We saw some tunnels. We learned about some of the plans to do this big raid over the border, coming out in tunnels all over the many communities. And sort of, it's like, wow, we kind of kicked this down the road, but we didn't cancel it.
Yeah, that was actually leading up to my next question. You were deployed around Gaza during these operations. I wanted to know, what did you learn about Hamas firsthand that I guess many people didn't understand? And when you watched October 7th unfold, having personally served along that border, what went through your mind?
So I think some of the things that really came to light in 2014 is we saw the plans sort of for October 7th, and you can look at the studies that went into that, the building of the underground infrastructure and the more formal training that Hamas was getting. You see these criticisms, it's not an army like the IDF is an army. It's like, well, it's not just a bunch of angry guys with small arms either. They have naval commandos, they have intelligence units, they have cyber units, they have drone units. And all of this was getting put in motion then. And there wasn't an intent to do it in 2014. And, because of the war that started, that probably moved things along, but it was very much planned. And it's funny, when October 7th happened, I remember I was at home and I'm starting seeing the reports, of rocket attacks and, an over the border raid. And I'm like, oh my God, this is insane. And then the following weeks that happened, I'm learning more about the tunnels and the kidnapping. I'm like, this is very familiar. I've read about this in textbooks. We saw it then. And it was very disappointing. I'm like, how did sort of Israel get lulled to sleep by this?
Yeah, exactly. Now, moving up to the northern border, we're discussing disarming Hezbollah. Now, the problem that Hezbollah itself refuses to disarm. Do we actually believe that the Lebanese armed forces are capable to confront Hezbollah? What could Israel do? What are your thoughts on that?
It is a very troubling situation, but at the same time, it's almost the most hopeful I've ever been for the Northern Front. We're seeing a lot of good things being said, a lot of good things on paper between Israel and the Lebanese government, who for the first time are sort of at least saying we're sick of Hezbollah bringing us into conflict. We don't like Israel very much, but we don't want to fight anymore. And they're making these agreements like the recent trilateral framework, which the United States helped broker, which says, okay, let's find a way where the Lebanese armed forces can assume responsibility for keeping Hezbollah disarmed out of the south, away from the Israeli border. And that sounds great to me. The problem, as you said, is can we really trust the Lebanese armed forces to do this? And even if they have the intent, do they have the capability? Which is something that we've experienced time and again. This isn't the first time that the Lebanese government has said, okay, yeah, we're going to be the only force responsible for security in Lebanon. We're going to have the monopoly of arms. And we often get these sort of minimal efforts, like, oh, look, here's, a weapons cache that the Lebanese army moved into and they destroyed it. There's a few arrests. And then as more news coverage happens, it's like, oh, well, this cache was actually abandoned already. And the arms that were confiscated was mostly small arms. And it's sort of rinse, wash, repeat. And that's really the problem that Israel and Lebanon are at. And then, as I said, I am still sort of feeling a little bit hopeful because the pilot zones have started. We are seeing Lebanese armed forces actually deploy to the border. How much they're doing does seem still to be at that minimal effort. But if it was ever going to work, I think now is the chance for it to work, as Hezbollah is at their weakest. And they've lost thousands of fighters. So much infrastructure has been destroyed. And the Lebanese government is under a lot of pressure from the United States to make this work. So if they can actually sort of spur themselves into action and really commit to the 2 pilot zones that they have, then that could be a sign for the IDF, like, okay, let's make 2, 3, let's make 3, 4, and gradually the IDF can pull back to the Israeli side of the border. And back to that, we don't like each other, but we don't want to fight either, can just sort of be the status quo.
We're having the same type of discussions with Hamas, trying to get them to disarm. How different is that situation? Do you think they're more likely, less likely to disarm? What are your thoughts on that?
So it's an interesting comparison because, as you said, they're sort of at these same stages. We've had such intense fighting for, since October 2023. And Hamas and Hezbollah, they've both been severely degraded, both in manpower and arms, but they're still holding on. They're still pushing. Every so often we saw just this morning, there was a sniper attack over the yellow line in Gaza, from over the yellow line towards IDF troops. So there's these IDF security zones. I would say the big difference is even if the Lebanese armed forces are doing minimal efforts, they're still doing something, and there isn't a comparable force in Gaza that is going to, we hear about the International Stabilization Force and, the Board of Peace, and very little is still happening on the ground. If that progresses, if there's actually some force to go into Gaza other than the IDF that can do those minimal efforts, it's still better than nothing, but that hasn't happened yet.
Now, as we know, in the past 2.5, 3 years, Iran's ring of fire has been severely damaged by Israel. How much of that ring of fire do you think actually still survives, and could it be revived again? What are your thoughts on that?
So the ring of fire, both in, what missiles and rockets and drones they have to bear, as well as the proxies, it has been severely degraded. And of course, it's all still hanging on, and that doesn't negate the progress that has been made. But what we're really seeing is an occasional missile into the Strait of Hormuz, or a rocket from Iraq, or a Hezbollah drone attack, or a Gaza sniper is just as effective at stalling peace talks, at bringing stability, as a much bigger arsenal. So it is still really there, but as far as we're going to bring Israel to its knees, that hasn't happened. Israel's proved itself to be the most capable military in the United States in the Middle East when the United States isn't there. And very few militaries could do what the IDF did. And it's really still hanging on, though, the ring of fire and the proxies.
Now, Iran is still exerting enormous pressure through, the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that Tehran lost militarily, but retained the ability to hold the global economy hostage? And if we give in to them through diplomacy, does that teach them that that's a pressure point that they can continue to use?
I think how you phrase it is pretty accurate. I think they have absolutely lost militarily. The US and the IDF and even the UAE to a small degree have launched significant strikes. The missile arsenal has been severely degraded, and whether that's destruction or buried, it's out of commission. With the few launchers they still have, as you said, they're exerting a lot of power, and they're showing how we can still cause this significant destabilization and launch a missile or two when we feel like it. And it is kind of getting into this cycle of, okay, we're going to ramp up attacks again if you don't quit. And then they say, okay, we'll stop. Let's go back to the talks. We talk some more, and then they strike at another ship. And we're just going around in circles now since the MOU, which is now defunct, but was very favorable to Iran. And you kind of wonder, it's like, why aren't you guys sort of getting with the program? You had this very favorable deal, and you could have still had your victory over America marches if you'd accepted it, which I think is an acceptable ending, but they were given a gift. And it's really proving like we have to get to a point where they're not going to try to hold the Straits of Hormuz hostage, because that is their one card to play now.
Now, you've served in Israel's military, like we said, and you also worked inside America's national security world. Do you think that Washington fully understands Israel's security needs, or there's some things that they don't understand yet?
I think there is a lot of understanding. There's obviously some differences. I love it when the goals overlap, but they're two independent nations. They have their own points of view on how to handle things, and the understanding is on the big picture. President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu both agree Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and I think that is kind of universal across the board. We've seen what they can do with missiles and proxies, and if they got a nuclear weapon, they'd be even more emboldened. Then there's just sort of the differences on how to go about achieving that. And that little bit of difference is able to be exploited, because we see, Israel dragged the U.S. into the war, and it didn't. Iran and the U.S. have been enemies since '79. They've caused havoc in, the tanker war. Their proxies have killed American servicemen, whether in Iraq or in Lebanon. And this is very much America's fight as much as it is Israel's. And those differences in understanding the security needs, I don't think it's of so much consequence that like, they're diverging. They're not going to be on the same page anymore. But it is there.
Now, obviously, there's a debate in America about the U.S.-Israel relationship. From a purely American national security perspective, what does the United States gain from Israel that people don't know?
We are definitely at an inflection point the last few years about how the U.S.-Israel relationship should evolve, as you said. And what the U.S. gains is having the most capable army in the Middle East, ready to get our backs at a moment's notice. And, as the U.S. attempts to pivot more towards other threats like the South China Sea and Taiwan, we can feel comfortable knowing Israel can handle things in the Middle East if we have other priorities. And that type of future security guarantee is of immense value. We don't want to get dragged into the Middle East every time something pops off. And having a capable Israel is to the United States' benefit. And that's just a future scenario. In the conflicts we've seen currently, Israel's launched thousands of strikes on Iran, which made the American military burden lighter. And that sort of burden sharing is exactly the type of behavior the president wants to see from other US partners. And then that's kind of just the big picture. You get into the mass amounts of intelligence sharing, you get into Israel strikes in Lebanon, which have killed Hezbollah commanders that were in charge of the Marine barracks bombing. They brought those people to justice. And just having those gains doesn't even get into our shared morals that we are similar countries. We have the same sort of values.
Exactly. Now, like we said, you have a unique perspective being a former IDF soldier and also now studying these threats professionally. Knowing everything that you know today, do you think Israel is safer than it was before October 7th?
I think it is safer than it was before October 7th in just the fact that a lot of these proxies in Iran have seen the lengths Israel's willing to go to, significant sacrifice. Many of the Israeli reservists still serving have served tremendous amount of time in conflict. They've spent, a massive defense budget, and they've expended, you hear about the US munitions crisis. Israel's in the same boat there. And they're sort of showing to the world, it's like, we are willing to really fight when it comes to it. And you compare that to some of our other Gulf partners that were also struck by Iran, and they kind of just sat back and said, we're going to let the US and Israel handle this. And they, barely will come to their own defense. Some countries did more than others. The UAE should definitely be applauded there. But the difference in what Israel is willing to do to defend itself is clear. And the threats have been severely degraded while still there, but severely degraded.
Now, obviously, Israel has to always be on guard. When you look at the next 5 or 10 years, do you think there's one country out there that Israel should be focused on, that they can become a threat to Israel? Is there anything that concerns you about the future?
Yeah, I think, despite what I just said about threats degraded, Iran is still the number one threat. They're still intent on, hanging on to as much power, even if they're weakened and Israel kind of rises. They're still kind of trying to project this image of we're the big dog in the Middle East. And they're going to do that by continuing to fund these proxies, continuing to arm them, and continuing to sow chaos across the region, not just at Israel, but at everyone. The other big threat that we're seeing, oddly enough, is from America's main partner in the Middle East through NATO is Turkey. And they, are a NATO ally, and they've shown, great capability militarily. They have a big defense budget. They have this, I think, the second biggest army in NATO. And at the same time, they've been tremendously hostile in terms of rhetoric towards Israel, which is our other great friend in the Middle East. And it's sort of getting to a tipping point of, it's like, is this just rhetoric? Are you actually intending to threaten Israel? And not just Israel, but Greece as well. And you can kind of see Turkey's point of view is that Israel is becoming this sort of hegemon in the region, and they don't like that. So they say, well, we'd rather be the hegemon. And are they kind of heading toward a collision course, whether they like it or not? But when you mix in this rhetoric and what we've seen in the past, some of it is not just rhetoric, but in fact, supporting Hamas. They have Hamas members are in Turkey right now. They could arrest them and extradite them if they wanted, but they're not going to do that. And so you see how many signs on the wall do we need before, is Turkey just talking, or is it a real concern?
It seems like President Trump is willing to negotiate with almost anyone, like Turkey, Qatar, and all these countries we mentioned, that could be harboring terrorists or could have negative thoughts about Israel. What do you think about President Trump's willingness to speak to everyone?
I think it is important. You're the leader of the free world. You should be speaking to everyone who wants to speak. That is how you eventually do resolve conflicts. Whether there's military action and then talking, there's always talking first. And I think there could be a tougher line with some of these countries. And, we're seeing with Turkey, just the other week, the president was saying how Turkey almost intervened in the war on Iran's behalf. And then this is part of the same discussion of, well, let's give them the F-35. And it's just, these are odd things to be talking about at the same time. But we should still always be talking, but we shouldn't give up assets like the F-35 if we're thinking this country might be intervening against us.
I want to ask you one last question. We didn't mention the Houthis. We saw that the Houthis claimed attacks on Saudi energy infrastructure. Does that demonstrate that the Houthis are still alive and able to carry out their terrorist attacks? How concerned should we be for the Houthis?
Yeah, so I'm not a Yemen expert, but as you've seen, the Houthis are still very much a force to be reckoned with there, and sort of that same way Iran is threatening the Straits of Hormuz, Houthis have kind of similar ability to threaten the maritime commerce that goes by them. It is absolutely still a problem, and despite past efforts by the United States to degrade them, they're managing to hold on.
Justin, I want to thank you for your time. Appreciate this conversation. How can people find you, read the articles that you write, and anything that you want to plug?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was great to kind of go over all of the happy news in the Middle East right now. If people want to find me, I'm on X, formerly Twitter, at Leopold-Cohen. All of my work is posted on the Foundation for Defense of Democracies alongside some of my great colleagues in the Center of Military and Political Power. That's the area I work in, CMPP. We kind of go over military affairs, whether it's Middle East, in Europe, or in Asia. And that's where I would recommend either Twitter or the FDD website.
Amazing. Thank you. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you.